introduce our guest speaker, who is Daniel Chard. Daniel is a history professor at Western Washington University, where he teaches courses on U.S. and Pacific Northwest history. He is the author of Nixon's War at Home, the FBI, Leftist Guerrillas, and the Origins of Counterterrorism, published in 1921. He has brought his... He's younger than me, and I was not alive in 1921. Sorry, Daniel. He holds PhD and Masters in History from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he has a BA from the University of Southern Maine. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
Have you.
Thanks, Irene.
And Daniel is going to talk about McCarthyism, and yeah, that'll give us something to think about. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Eileen, and thank you to all of you who are here in the League of Women Voters. As a group and as individuals, you have a long history of building community and upholding democracy here in Whatcom County and beyond, and I very much appreciate the vital work that you do. I'd also like to thank my fantastic students at Western Washington University, particularly those who took my course on the United States in the Cold War last winter. It's because of them that I'm able to work at the job that I love, and our conversations have informed the perspectives that I'm here to share with you today. Can people hear me okay? Yeah. All right, good. Yeah, I consider it a great honor to be invited here to discuss the history and legacies of McCarthyism with you. And my plan is to offer an overview of McCarthyism, followed by some reflections on how McCarthyism is both similar to and distinct from the authoritarianism and political repression of the current administration. Before I do this, though, I'd like to define a few key terms. The first is communism. Communism and socialism encompass a range of ideas centered on the notion that capitalism is based on the exploitation of workers, and that humanity would be better off with a political and economic system in which wealth is shared and enjoyed by all. These ideas fueled mass movements throughout the world in the 20th century. The first successful revolution carried out in the name of these ideas, as some of you probably know, occurred in Russia in 1917, after which the term communism referred to those on the socialist left who joined various international branches of the Communist Party allied with the Soviet Union. Though problematic, in the 1930s, the Communist Party of the USA was the most dynamic organization on the US left. The party at this time was allied with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who would also be an ally of the US in World War II. And during the war, a small number of American communists engaged in espionage for the Soviet Union. But for the most part, the party operated autonomously from Moscow in the United States, and most of its members were focused on their domestic activities. Despite a relatively small membership of approximately 60,000 at its peak, the Communist Party helped rebuild the labor movement during the New Deal and was influential in the civil rights movement, Hollywood and the arts, and in government agencies such as the State Department and the Department of Labor. Right. The second term, which I'm sure most of you are also familiar with, is the Cold War, which was a global conflict by nuclear-armed superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies. At the beginning of the Cold War, however, after World War II, the United States was the lone nuclear power. The Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons as a deterrent against the US. It was called the Cold War because the US and the Soviet Union thankfully never engaged in direct combat, a situation that would have likely ended in what US military strategists referred to as mutually assured destruction. However, the term Cold War is a misnomer, since in the period from 1945 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the superpower conflict manifested in many bloody hot wars throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia, including in Korea and Vietnam. It's important to note that during the Cold War, US political leaders in both political parties frequently worked to demonstrate their toughness in the face of communism because of the powerful influence that anti-communism had in domestic politics. All right. A third term is terrorism. I won't get into this topic much now, though I might mention it in this lecture, but I want to mention that my book, Nixon's War at Home, examines how and why our contemporary understanding of the term terrorism and notions of terrorism as a major national security threat and the preemptive policing and military tactics of counterterrorism. I look at how all those things emerge in the 1970s. And from the next book that I'm working on, it's called Remaking the Security State. I'm examining the politics of anti-terrorism and its connection to authoritarian strains in American politics, from Watergate to the 9/11 era. And I'd happy to discuss some of this more during the Q&A if you'd like. All right, so with these concepts in mind, let's return to our main topic, McCarthyism. It's a term used to describe the political repression that dominated American politics after World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, in a period known by historians as the Second Red Scare. As you may know, the first national Red Scare happened after World War I, but the Second Red Scare was far wider in its reach. Ellen Schrecker, the preeminent historian of McCarthyism, has described the post-World War II Red Scare as the most widespread and longest lasting wave of political repression in American history. The McCarthy-era Red Scare was a concerted, top-down campaign that destroyed lives, careers, and institutions of the US left. In the late 1940s and 1950s, prominent politicians, bureaucrats, and anti-communist activists targeted members, former members, and accused members of the Communist Party, even though the organization never posed a real threat to US national security. I can talk about some of that espionage that happened during World War II if you'd like, but the Red Scare effectively destroyed the party and its influence on American society. Perhaps more importantly, though, McCarthyism, as Schrecker put it, narrowed the spectrum of acceptable US political debate. Consequences of stifled political debate included weakening of the labor movement, delays in the struggle to end Jim Crow racial segregation, stagnation in the movement for women's equality, the defeat of universal health care, and expansive US militarism that manifested in wars in Korea and Vietnam and deadly CIA-backed coups in places like Iran and Guatemala, which those countries are still feeling the consequences of today. Schrecker has also emphasized that the term McCarthyism is misleading. The repression of the Second Red Scare went far beyond the antics of its namesake, the demagogue Republican Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, and it both predated and outlasted the peak years of McCarthy's influence from 1950 to 1954. The anti-communist network that fueled the Red Scare included businessmen opposed to organized labor and the New Deal, private detective agencies, right-wing activists and intellectuals, senators and congressmen, who led televised hearings on behalf of bodies like the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and the House Un-American Activities Committee. And perhaps most importantly, the powerful FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who conducted extensive investigations of alleged communists and supplied congressional committees and the Department of Justice with key intelligence used in their witch hunts. Anti-communist liberals like President Harry S. Truman, despite enduring frequent criticism by right-wing figures like McCarthy for being pink or supposedly one step from being communist themselves, they were also key figures in the Second Red Scare. Yet despite its limits, the term McCarthyism has endured in our popular understanding. Though the scale of its repression did not match that of the Nazis or of Stalin's Soviet Union, the results of McCarthyism were dire. They included 2 people executed, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, as well as a few hundred imprisoned or deported, and 10 to 12,000 people fired from their jobs, particularly in the fields of education, civil service, science, and entertainment. Sadly and shamefully, McCarthyism was made possible by the American populace, the vast majority of whom were complicit in civil liberties violations that most would not have accepted previously because of the prominence of the post-war anti-communist hysteria. One can note some disturbing characteristics shared by McCarthyism and the right-wing populism of President Donald Trump and similar figures in other parts of the world. For one, leading figures of both McCarthyism and Trumpism exploited new communication media technologies to attack truth and undermine popular faith in democratic institutions. While social media has been crucial to the rise of right-wing populism, Joe McCarthy and his collaborators exploited what was then the new mass media platform of television. In February 1950, McCarthy metamorphosized from one of the most ineffectual members of the Senate into the leading voice of anti-communist outrage when he proclaimed in a televised speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, that he possessed a list of 207 subversives supposedly employed by the State Department. These claims were patently false, and other anti-communists, including Richard Nixon, had been lodging similar accusations for years. But McCarthy's wild claims gained traction because he deftly timed his outrageous statements to coincide with television journalists' evening production deadlines, and his fear-mongering antics attracted viewers. The historical context was important too. For several years, President Truman had been stoking fear of an exaggerated national security threat posed by the Soviet Union. And after the twin shocks of 1949, the communist revolution in China, and the Soviet Union's first successful test of an atomic weapon, many Americans were primed to believe McCarthy's wild accusations. There was real fear, right, of nuclear war. Here's another similarity. Both Cold War anti-communists and MAGA Republicans leaders scapegoated those they defined as domestic enemies to justify their undermining of due process and the rule of law. As Strecker and fellow historian Philip Deary have noted, the political repression of the Second Red Scare was justified by its perpetrators under the prevailing assumption that commies had no rights that deserved protection, right? These were people who were outside of deserving of constitutional protections, right? There was an exception because of the national security threat they supposedly posed, but that wasn't true. Trashing of due process was a core characteristic of McCarthy era repression. From the firing of individuals in both the private and public sectors, to deportations and passport denials, to the FBI's break-ins, bugging, and warrantless wiretapping, to congressional hearings designed for television audiences, to criminal indictments and convictions of Communist Party leaders for what amounted to thought crimes, and to the most heinous state crime of the Second Red Scare, the execution of the Rosenbergs, two young parents, on bogus charges. We now know that Julius was, in fact, a low-level Soviet spy during World War II, but he did not share atomic secrets as charged, and Ethel had no direct involvement in espionage. Trump's stated domestic enemies, which shifted somewhat between his two presidencies, have included immigrants, Muslims, Antifa, and others he's associated with terrorism, transgender people, Palestine solidarity activists, so-called radical left lunatics who promote critical race theory, DEI, woke ideology, or radical gender ideology, and the Democratic Party. Examples of the Trump administration's due process violations are many and include now arrest of some Democratic Party officials. But they also notably include the incarceration of Mahmoud Khalil of Columbia University and other students involved in protests against Israel's US-backed war on Gaza. It's also worth mentioning that the demagoguery and repression of both McCarthyism and Trumpism obfuscated the perpetrators' broader political agendas. In both cases, the agenda was similar: to discredit the notion that government exists to provide for the public good and to roll back the social democratic welfare and regulatory state established during the New Deal. That's the agenda that the Doge has been doing through executive fiat. In addition, homophobia was an important component of both McCarthyism and Trumpism. The Second Red Scare ran parallel to a Lavender Scare that saw thousands of gay men fired from the State Department and other federal agencies, and there were lesbians persecuted as well. Disturbingly, in some ways, current threats to American democracy are greater today than what the nation faced in the early Cold War. Worse than McCarthyism is the title of a recent op-ed by Ellen Schrecker on Trump's attack on higher education. Schrecker noted that while approximately 100 tenured university professors were fired and blacklisted during the McCarthy era, The current wave of attacks is intended to wipe out the system of American higher education as we know it. It is important to note that weaponized charges of anti-Semitism related to protests of Israel's war on Gaza are the Trojan horse for MAGA Republican attacks on higher education. And the broad reach of Trump's war on higher education is now coming to Bellingham. Earlier this month, the Department of Justice initiated an investigation of alleged anti-Semitism at Western Washington University, the university I love and where I teach amazing students in the most beautiful part of the world. The partisan nature of the probe is evident by the fact that it is one of at least 60 other such university investigations, and that it is focused solely on one form of discrimination to the exclusion of others, including Islamophobia. This is happening while Western and other public universities in our state are sadly struggling to manage devastating budget cuts imposed by Washington's Democratic-controlled legislature. Yet there are significant differences between McCarthyism, between the McCarthy era and now. Perhaps the most important is that Trumpism has been far less successful than anti-communism in dominating American public opinion. Lacking popular support for much of his agenda, despite his election victory and narrow Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, Trump rules through fear, intimidation, and executive fiat. Nevertheless, Americans' commitment to our democracy is widespread, as is opposition to Trump's authoritarian and oligarchical rule, even if this is yet to take on a form of mass political organization. The fact that you, the League of Women Voters, invited me to this meeting to lecture on McCarthyism and that you all came to participate in the discussion is but one testament to this. There is much more I could say about the legacies and lessons of McCarthyism, including the historical threads about the historical threads that run from the Second Red Scare through Nixon's Watergate scandal and Reagan's Iran-Contra scandal and Bush's and Obama's war on terror to our current contemporary moment. But instead, I'll conclude with one of the most important lessons of McCarthyism. It ended, okay? And it ended because Americans stood up to the anti-communist bullies. One example was the freshman Republican Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, then the only woman of the Senate, who in 1950 publicly denounced what she referred to as McCarthy's hate and character assassination sheltered by the shield of congressional immunity. Another was the great Rosa Parks. Her refusal to move to the back of the bus in 1957 not only ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, the first major battle of the post-war civil rights movement, but it helped break public fears of anti-communism, which Southern white demagogues used as an ideological cudgel to uphold Jim Crow. 3 years later, when it seemed like that movement had stalled out, 4 Black students at North Carolina Agricultural College, Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, launched a sit-in to desegregate a Greensboro Woolworth's lunch counter. They rebooted the civil rights movement and inspired the anti-war movement and women's movement that followed. And it's worth mentioning that the civil rights movement also helped inspire the indigenous fishing movement in the 1960s and 70s that is so important to our history here in the state of Washington. So as we face an ongoing authoritarian coup, and I don't say that lightly, it's incumbent upon us to remember these and other Americans who, in the face of ridicule, persecution, and sometimes violent repression, had the courage not only to defend democracy and civil society, but to go further and make our institutions more inclusive and responsive to the needs of our diverse citizenry. Thank you. So, is there a Q&A period, or do we just chat during the break? Yeah.
Questions? Donna's got a question.
You were comparing it to the period after the First World War, or the First World War, and a few years after the First Red Scare. I just finished the book on that period, and it seemed to be maybe altogether more violent, physically violent than the 50s. The 50s was maybe more underground and menacing in a different kind of way. But maybe I missed a lot. you know, I was just a kid in a small part of the country, you know, kind of isolated.
Yeah.
So I don't know what kind of physical activities, I'm poor, I mean, I find it hard to understand that physical violence, how people understand, wow. Is that true? Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I'll speak to that. I'll try to be concise with it. The first Red Scare after World War I, there was widespread labor unrest in the country, and there had been off and on since the, you know, post-Civil War period, the second half of the 19th century. There was a general strike in Seattle in 1919. It lasted 5 days. It didn't succeed in its goals. After the failure of this general strike, there were some in the anarchist movement, which was kind of, and in a faction of the anarchist movement, which was kind of a small segment of the left, but that had an influential role in the labor movement. There were some of them who started believed that a kind of a shortcut to revolution was through bombings and assassinations. And William McKinley, after all, was assassinated by an anarchist, one who was kind of renounced by much of the anarchist movement. But anyway, there was a series of bombings by anarchists, including one, a young Italian immigrant anarchist tried to bomb the Attorney General's house and died in the process. And there was something called the Palmer raids. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General, and he led a series of raids against radicals, but it was a broad sweep, especially Italians and Russians and Eastern Europeans, a lot of Jews in the, and so that was a lot of the first Red Scare, but it's kind of destroyed a lot of the labor movement. The second Red Scare, what made it possible was that there was some espionage during World War II. And the context for that was that some in the Communist Party, young people who didn't believe a lot of the reports about Stalin in the newspaper, they didn't believe it because if they went to Union Square in New York and got beat up by the cops, they'd read in the New York Times the next day, communist agitators, you know, agitated a protest. So they're like, I don't believe this propaganda in the newspaper. Later, when Stalin's crimes are admitted by Khrushchev, you know, you know, before then they start to trickle in and people start to dissent, but then there's a major reckoning and the things fall apart. But anyway, but some young communists felt during World War II, the US is allied with Stalin, and the Russians, who are in a workers' paradise, those people are fighting the Nazis alone on the Eastern Front. And the US is developing this awful weapon, and the Soviet Union needs it to protect themselves from the US. That's what they thought, you know? But anyway, but there was real espionage, and that was the justification, but it was completely overblown. The threat of national security was completely overblown. So there wasn't really that kind of violence, but there was accusations that the Communist Party promoted take a revolution by force, and that's why their speech even had to be snuffed out.
I read after the news all came out about Harvard and the fight that they are still going through with the government, that the universities that used to be the Big 10, now it's the Big 20 something, signed a pact that they would all support each other if, you know, this came to them. And I wonder if Western was part of that or not. They were part of that group, of course, but, you know, are you working with other universities to keep the integrity of the university?
Yeah, no, I thank you for asking that question, and I think probably
Repeat the question.
sure. If I may, my understanding of the question is that there are some universities that, after Trump's attacks on Harvard, started signing pacts to try to mutually support each other against these attacks, and was asking Western's involvement. And thank you for caring. You know, I think a lot of people here have college degrees and see the importance of public, especially public higher education, for like building a middle class, giving young people a chance at a future, right? And especially that universities like Western like provide a public good, even though the tuition has become more expensive, and we have such great students from all kinds of backgrounds. So anyway, those kind of pacts, they're works in progress. My understanding of the pact that it was Rutgers and UMass, my alma mater, and some others started to pass. That was the faculty senates calling on their administrators to form that pact, and they're still in process. And And at Western I got a colleague here from both in our union and in the faculty senate, there's discussion of like how to start building those things. So I guess, did that answer your question?
Well, I assume that you would think that that was an important thing that you should support.
Yes, we should, and we should be working together. Yeah, I know, and we also need the state legislature. We have a collective problem, which is that our state legislators don't believe that students, faculty, staff, and alumni, and others who benefit from public education are a constituency that matters. Because in the latest round of budget cuts that Governor Ferguson signed, devastating cuts to higher education, millions of dollars. And Western has been just earlier this week announced more people they're laying off, including administrators. So we're gonna survive it, but that's a problem that we need to work on together. I think. So in addition to these attacks on higher education as a whole, maybe I'll do a couple of questions like popcorn style since there's time. Do you want?
No, you do it.
1, 2. Is that okay?
Go for it.
1, 2, 3. They're popping off, as the young people say.
My concern is you said, yes, McCarthyism did stop, but it was Republicans that called on him and made him, and they framed him in the Senate. Right now with our negative Republicans, we do not have that going to be happening in the near future. It's pretty much dependent on what happens with the next election, but that's very concerning to me.
I agree. And that's a big difference between then and now, is that taking over of a party.
Well, that was part of my question, what McCarthyism ended. What do we have to learn from what ended McCarthyism?
Or how do we stop the cycle from just the next Red Scare to the next one, to the next one? You know, how do we learn from that?
Because it doesn't seem like there's somebody standing up saying, have you no shame?
Yeah.
There is no shame.
Well, taking this right out of school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, but it's a small thing, and it's important. I agree. Let me take a couple. These are good questions. Let me take a couple more from friends over here, and then I'll try to respond to several. In the green.
Social media today is our most destructive force. What can we respond? What can we do in this?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah, my friend.
I'd like to know a little bit about the role of the federal courts in the early 50s as compared to now.
A good question, and yeah.
I'd like to hear about the premise of your book you're working on as well.
Sure. Oh, thanks. All right, you gave me plenty of stuff to talk about. I'm gonna answer these questions not directly in the order that they're answered, but I'll start with social media. And there are ways in which it allows certain ideas to spread quickly. Some of the big protests we've seen over the last decade around the world have been mobilized in part through social media and some union organizing. It's been a tool. But I would agree with you that I do think it's more destructive than positive. It's much more useful for movements that are trying to destroy institutions than it is for movements that are trying to build democracy and mass popular participation and build democratic institutions. That's really hard work that as you all know, involves face-to-face relationships and slow deliberation, conversation, building of trust, right? Yeah. Social media is just for profit, facilitates undermining trust, undermining bonds of human solidarity. So how do we get around it? How do we, I'm not going to stand up here with easy answers. I don't know, but I do think that this civil society and mass movements are what's necessary. Yeah. And I know this is a nonpartisan organization, so But I think the Democratic Party has deep problems too, you know? Yeah, yeah. So how do we stop Trumpism? I don't see the establishment of the Democratic Party as being the alternative to Trumpism. What's interesting though, I'll just say this without giving away too much of my political affinities. The Democratic primary in New York just happens, is Zohran Mamdani won the nomination, and on a campaign of talking about affordability, right? That's something that affects Americans of all kinds of backgrounds. And the early results of some of the analysis of his primary win shows that, I mean, he had an incredible door knocking campaign, mass movement involvement, but he was knocking on doors in the areas where Trump won the 2024 election, right? By talking about affordability. So it shows that like a lot of people who voted for Trump, you know, they're fed up with the lack of affordability and the corrupt political system under both political parties. And Trump was offering a false solution. But some people were feeling like, I don't know, out of these two people, I'll choose this guy, right? And some of those people voted for Mamdani. So there's something to be learned from that, I think. Okay, so the federal courts, a key thing, and you know, I'll admit there's probably some people here whose understanding of the federal court history is better than mine off the top of my head without my notes in front of me. But a key thing, I forgot the exact year that the court kind of shifted into the Warren Court of Earl Warren as the Chief Justice. That was before Brown versus Board of Education in 1956. But around that time, when part of it was Roosevelt appointed judges as well as some appointed by Eisenhower, they moved the court in a different direction that was more open to civil liberties and civil rights. So that was, and from 1956 through the civil rights era and the rights revolution of the 1960s, that was an important component of the changes in society and politics in the 1960s. Briefly, my watch like ran out of batteries and I left it on. Sure. I was like working on this all last night this morning. In my first book, Nixon's War at Home. What I'm looking at is how the FBI ends up responding to bombings, police assassinations, and other kind of violence carried out by groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army that came out of the radical anti-war movement, student movement, and Black Power movement. And I look at how it developed started using this word terrorism more. And then especially after there is a rise in the Palestinian nationalist movement's embrace of airline hijacking and hostage taking in international media situations like the Munich Olympics in 1972. This term terrorism becomes like a global international thing that's discussed. But I also looked at how it becomes politicized too by people by Nixon and others. So, and I look at the origins of kind of preemptive policing tactics of counterterrorism. So the next book, what I'm looking at is it kind of starts off with, if some of you might remember, in 1975 there was massive government investigations of the FBI and other intelligence agencies, including in the Senate led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. It's called the Church Commission, and almost everything we know about the CIA and the FBI during the Cold War comes out of those Senate investigations, right? And also the reforms to the Freedom of Information Act that were passed in that post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era, 1974, that have made government more transparent, even though a lot of agencies still really block that stuff, block releases of information. Anyway, what I'm starting off is looking at some of the pushback to the Church Committee and to intelligence reform. A lot of it came from a partisan right-wing movements, including among former intelligence officers. And I'm looking kind of the interplay between this use of a politics of anti-terrorism that had parallels to anti-communism. But terrorism, there's also like real violence, right? A lot of which was really scary, deadly, painful, harmful. and state violence. So I'm looking at the kind of interplay between some of this partisan anti-terrorism and some of the more bipartisan problem-solving efforts to make anti-terrorism legislation. But a working hypothesis is that among both of these general groups, neither one of them really worked to ever fundamentally address the national security state and militarism that was US militarism that helped motivate a lot of the violent dissidents against US policies. So I'm looking basically, what's the history behind the Patriot Act, which was passed after 9/11, over 400 pages long, and where did those ideas come from? And a lot of them were brewing in the Watergate and post-Watergate era. So it's gonna take me a few years to before I'm done, but thanks to my students and my colleagues at Western, I hopefully get to do that.
They'd never let you go. There's just one more question.
Okay.
I want to know what's happening at Western, bringing the conservative leaning students with the less conservative leaning students to have dialogue around some of this stuff. And how do you feel about the future with the students that you are part of?
That's a good question. I sometimes joke that at Western, debates between liberals and the anti-capitalist left are more lively than those between liberals and conservatives. But there are conservative students, and I have excellent conservative students. I always, try to value all of their views. In terms of actual like coalition building and movement building, I'm not exactly sure, but it's a really good question and something for me to think about and look towards. I have in mind that one really great, fantastic student who I know is open conservative, and we've had great conversations, and he's in my mind right now, but it's something that needs to happen. Yeah. Thank you.